Good evening. I'm Rachel Floor, Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. On behalf of all of my library and foundation colleagues, I am delighted to welcome all of you who are watching tonight's program online. To open, I humbly start with a land acknowledgement to recognize the Indigenous tribes of the Pawtucket and Massachusetts peoples of the Wampanoag Tribal Confederation territories, who both past and present and throughout many generations have stewarded the land where the Kennedy Library is today. While a land acknowledgement is not enough, it's an important way to promote Indigenous visibility, and it serves as a reminder that we are all on stolen and settled Indigenous land. I invite us all to contemplate how to better support Indigenous communities and to learn how to honor and take care of the land that each of us inhabits. I would also like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and AT&T, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe and WBUR. Tonight's program is also supported in part through the Government of Ireland Immigrant Support Programme. Many thanks to the Consulate General of Ireland in Boston, Consul General Alicia Moore, and Vice Consul General Shane Caffrey for their work in supporting of tonight's program. Neal Thompson has kindly agreed to sign book plates for his newest book. Our bookstore will be selling copies if you are interested, and details and a link are in the description for tonight's program on our YouTube page. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. We are so grateful to have this opportunity to explore the earliest years of the Kennedy family's life in America with our distinguished guests this evening. Much of Neal Thompson's research took place at the Kennedy Library archives, and we are very pleased to learn more about his work and the lives of Bridget and Patrick Kennedy this evening. I'm now delighted to introduce tonight's speakers. We are so glad to welcome Neal Thompson to the Kennedy Library virtually. A journalist and the author of 6 acclaimed books, he has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Esquire, Outside, and numerous other media outlets. His new book is The First Kennedys, The Humble Roots of an American Dynasty. I'm also delighted to welcome to the library virtually our moderator for this evening, Christine Kinealy. Christine is Professor of History and the founding director of Ireland's Great Hunger Institute at Quinnipiac University. She has published extensively on Ireland's Great Hunger and the Irish abolition movement. Among her numerous awards and honors, she has been named one of the top educators in Irish America. And now to help us welcome our special guests, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Alicia Moore, the Consul General of Ireland to New England, to say a few words. Over to you, Alicia.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and I'm really delighted that the consulate is once again working with our good friends in the Kennedy Library. A couple of days ago, President Biden issued a proclamation declaring March to be Irish American Heritage Month, and it outlines not just Ireland's deep links with America, but also the really vast contribution that Americans of Irish heritage have made in this country. So I think it is really fitting that today this event explores the humble Irish origins of one of America's most prolific political families. And I'm delighted that we're going to hear from author Neal Thompson about his new and very interesting research on the family's origins, and also that we're going to hear from somebody who, as we just heard, is a renowned expert on Irish history, Professor Kinealy. I am very happy that this event marks one of the first of many that the consulate is going to celebrate with our friends in New England to mark St. Patrick's Day. And I'm especially happy that since I first arrived in Boston, it will be my first chance to celebrate with many people here in person this month. But I have to say that this joy is tempered by some heartbreak because of the events that we are witnessing at present. reflecting on Irish history for a moment, when President Kennedy visited Ireland back in 1963, he remarked that 8 of his great grandparents came from Ireland, and his ancestors left a land of oppression. And the connection between Ireland and America, it's in many ways, it's been the story of America's long support for Ireland and its struggle for self-determination. And I'm just very struck that today that we are watching scenes that are truly horrific as another European country, Ukraine, is struggling for its freedom and its right to self-determination. And, you know, Ireland, as I think many of people watching will know, it's a country that knows from its history the value of solidarity and support from other friends abroad, not least from this country. So I do want to take this opportunity to acknowledge in a small way and to express Ireland's strong support and solidarity for the people of Ukraine. I think it's fitting, you know, given this discussion and given the talk that we are going to have this evening on Irish history. So thank you all very much. Thank you very much to the Kennedy Library and to our speaker and our moderator and everybody who has joined us for this special event. And I'm delighted to hand over now to our moderator, Professor Kinealy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Liz and Rachel of the Kennedy Library, for hosting this event. Leisha, thank you for your lovely words. And if I can just follow on by what you're saying, because many of the famine emigrants who came to this country in the 1840s and 1850s were economic and political refugees. And what we're witnessing at the moment is, again, the flight of political and economic refugees. And my heart goes out to them. I hope the situation comes to an end soon. But tonight is a more joyous occasion, escape perhaps for 90 minutes. And I want to start off by saying congratulations to Neal on this fantastic book. I read it within 24 hours. I literally couldn't put it down, a few coffee breaks. And it's beautifully written, it's accessible, and it tells a story that deserves to be told and to be better known. So I want to say happy St. Patrick's Month, as Leisha has already intimated. We no longer can celebrate St. Patrick in one day, we need a whole month to celebrate him. But for me, my favourite Irish saint is, of course, St. Bridget, who up till recently has really been written out of history, ignored. And I'm delighted that this year, Ireland actually celebrated and acknowledged St. Bridget's Day, the 1st of February. We're hoping it will be a national holiday. And it just seems as we remember St. Bridget, it brings us full circle to remembering another Bridget who has been in some ways written out of history, been invisible, been overshadowed by the men in her life. And I really want to commend you, Neal, for the fact that you put Bridget Murphy at the front and centre of the early Kennedys. And could you perhaps explain why you did this and what process took you to wanting to learn more about the early Kennedys?
Yeah, thanks, Christine. Thanks for being here with me. Thanks for doing this. I wanted to echo my thanks to the staff at the JFK Library, to Rachel for the wonderful introduction, to Liz, and just an early shout out. I'll probably make others later in the program, to the staff at the archives at the Kennedy Library, who have been just heroes to me, helped this book enormously, and I just have a lot of admiration and respect and gratitude for them. Thanks also to Leisha for being here and for the kind introduction. And then I would second and support the words from Leisha and from you, Christine, in support of the people of Ukraine and what's happening right now. As you said, Christine, the Irish were, they experienced their own crumbling of a country and their own necessary escape to safety and a place where they might find economic means that they weren't able to find at home. This is a story that has spoken to me and nagged at me for more than 20 years. I want to talk about Bridget mostly, but I want to briefly say that this story, my interest in this story goes back to 1999 when John F. Kennedy Jr. died. And I was a newspaper reporter at the time. I was covering that story for the Baltimore Sun magazine. I went up to Hyannisport and staked out the Kennedy compound there, and with a bunch of other reporters, and was in a bar when they found the wreckage, and the bartender who had given me a Jameson that I was sipping when the news came that they had found the wreckage, she burst into tears and said she felt like she had lost a family member. And you know, I'm half Irish. I grew up Irish Catholic, 16 years of Catholic education. I'm not unfamiliar with the Kennedys and bits of their history, but I never necessarily had an interest in writing a book about them or going deeper into their history or understanding more. Never knew about Bridget until I started this project. But that incident with John F. Kennedy Jr., which was followed by my drive south to my home in Baltimore, and I passed through my home state of New Jersey and came within a couple of miles of the cemetery where my Irish immigrant grandparents, Bridget and Patrick, are buried. And something about that contrast between the Kennedys, who were at that time so famous, so beloved, so tragic, such a mythic, epic saga around that family, and then my poor grandparents, something got triggered in me, and I started to appreciate more deeply my Irish roots and heritage, started to develop a deeper curiosity about my grandmother's history, where she came from, what life was like for her when she came to America. I would later learn that she was a maid, just like Bridget Kennedy was, Bridget Murphy Kennedy. But I couldn't quite figure out from that point forward for many years exactly how to find a way into a story about the early Kennedys. What I wanted to understand was, where did they come from? Who came to America first? What was life like for them when they got here? You know, I know we're not always the most welcoming country to incoming immigrants. We say we are, many of us believe we are and should be, but it's not always the case. And it wasn't the case for the incoming Irish. So I wanted to find a story that told many stories, in fact. I wanted to explore the origins of the Kennedy family in America. I wanted to understand Irish immigration in America. I wanted to understand life for Irish immigrants in the 1800s, which is when Bridget came here. Other books kept getting in the way, and it wasn't until 2016-17 when we started having very different, more aggressive, more angry conversations about immigration in this country, where I realized I have to figure this story out. I have to go deeper. And at some point along this long journey, I discovered that, you know, Bridget Murphy came here during the potato famine, met and married Patrick Kennedy, and decided that's how I want to start my story. I want to bring Bridget Murphy Kennedy to life and show what life was like for her in the slums of East Boston, trying to raise her kid in an atmosphere that hated her kind, hated the Irish, hated the Catholics. How did she do it? What was her life like? And how did she create a life and a family that gave us the Kennedys that we know today? So that's where it all began, as far as finding Bridget and deciding I had to do whatever it took to bring her to life.
Okay, so almost two tragedies: one, the death of young Kennedy, and then the second, the tragedy of the famine. And as you said, that was the trigger for so much emigration. We know between 1846 and 1856, approximately 2 million people left Ireland. And what makes Irish emigration remarkable is increasingly more women than men left Ireland. That is very, very unusual.
Remarkable.
Remarkable. So Bridget is one of those women, the fact you found her. So would you like to take us back to Wexford, where, in a sense, Bridget began, and her story that leads her to take that decision in 1848?
Yeah. She was born and raised on a small family farm in a little village called Clunach in County Wexford. And like many of these small family farms, they had very little. You know, they all lived in one or two buildings, you know, whitewashed, stone-walled huts, if you will, in some cases. And what I think it's interesting you raise that point about more Irish women coming to America than the men, because I think it says a lot about what life was like for them in Ireland. If the famine had not happened, life would not have been great for her anyway, you know, and she might have wanted to escape anyway. You know, her prospects were stay on the family farm and work for her parents if one of her siblings, married first, and the dowry went to one of her sisters, or find some man in town and maybe become a farm wife for the rest of her life. That was, I described life in Ireland at that time. It was peasant life, if you lived in the country, which she did. So the prospects weren't great. And then the famine hits and it devastated that country. You know this more than anyone. You've written about it more eloquently and beautifully than anyone. And I'll confess, when I started this project, I thought, well, how am I going to match up to books like yours and research and achievements like yours? There's been so much written about the famine, but I really wanted to find a way to tell the story through Bridget's eyes. So I think her family didn't suffer as much as some others. They were tenant farmers. They didn't own their land. They had to pay rent to an absentee English landlord who actually owned the land that they were on. This was the case for many, many, thousands, if not millions of Irish farms and farmers. So they had to grow crops to pay their landlord, and then they subsisted on potatoes primarily. That was made up the bulk of their source of food. When the famine hit and devastated all of those crops, it just ruined that country economically and culturally and in other ways. So at some point, Bridget, we don't know exactly how the decision was made, who made the decision. I like to think that Bridget raised her hand and said, okay, I'll go. I think you see in the tenacity that we see in her character later, that she was probably someone who was willing to take this risk and take on this adventure to cross the Atlantic, to go to a new land, to set up a sort of a beachhead of sorts for her family and start things anew. Knowing no one over there. There were some cousins who were going over around the same time. But I think it speaks to her character and the character of many of the other Irish women who went in large numbers, as you said, more so than the men, going to a new country alone on these incredibly dangerous ships. As you know, they were called coffin ships because they sank, they burned, they were full of disease. There wasn't enough food to go around. Maybe they would take 4 to 6 weeks to cross the Atlantic. Maybe they would take 8 to 10 weeks, depending on weather. It was a treacherous, dangerous, often deadly journey. I describe one emigre writing in his journal about the dead bodies that were thrown overboard. Splash, splash, splash all day long. So that was her, the beginning of her adventure was escaping Ireland, making this deadly crossing, and then showing up in a country that didn't really want her. So remarkable character, incredibly strong and ambitious and tenacious. But she gets to America, and then her journey has only just begun from that point. It's, as we discover in the book, and we'll talk about it more, she hit hardship at every turn, and overcame those hardships.
Okay. And you've talked about the coffin ships, which were very famous. Perhaps could you talk more about the journey? Because most people went to Liverpool. It wasn't even a direct journey. We know most of the voyages were unregulated. And then when people got to Boston, they were often isolated. They were treated in an antagonistic way. Could you talk more about the journey itself, though?
Yeah, it was terrifying. And there's a lot of material that's available about what other Irish emigres experienced during that journey. Many of them went to, as you said, Liverpool, England first. That was their first stop. They took a smaller ship, got there, waited for their larger ship to prepare to leave, or in many cases, they didn't have a ticket to cross. So they would end up in Liverpool, which was overwhelmed by tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Irish refugees trying to find a ship to take them west, in most cases, to the US primarily, but also to Canada. And Liverpool was also a dangerous and deadly place, full of disease and these sub-street basement apartments that were available for rent for a few days. There were a lot of scammers on the prowl trying to trick the Irish into buying a ticket that was expired, or to give them their money to exchange it for currency, and they would lose all their money and not be able to buy their ticket to go to America. I mean, there were tripwires every step. And so she navigated that treacherous scene in this giant smoky city of industry that was, 100 times larger than the village that she grew up in. And she was almost instantly surrounded by, many hundreds of times more people than she came into contact with on a given day. It's just astounding to think of the shock that it must have been to her to end up in this seething, teeming city of Liverpool and try and find her way to the ticket office and find her way to the docks where the ship was leaving. And then, as you said, and you've written about, the crossing itself was horrific. The British ships were more dangerous and less regulated than the American ships. I'll call out that we don't know with 100% certainty which ship she was on. And I explain this in the book. Bridget and Murphy were two of the most common names in Ireland. So even though there are records showing passengers on many of these ships, and in the book, I narrow it down to two ships that were probably one or the other that she crossed on. Both of them had a history of wreckages and deaths and tragic crossings. So regardless of which ship she was on, we know it was a risky, dangerous journey. Women gave birth during the crossing, which could again take 4 to 6 or more weeks. Many women lost their newborn children on those crossings, and the babies were wrapped into sailcloth and tossed overboard. Often there wasn't enough food, there wasn't enough water. The emigres were crammed below decks into these, stacked multiple cots high and squeezed two people to one bed, sharing like 2 feet of space for 2 people for weeks and weeks at a time. So it was a terrible way to escape a tragedy that was befalling your country. And it says a lot about what she wanted next in her life, that she was willing to take that risk and take on that terrible journey, and then show up in this place on the other side, where I describe one of the refugees stepping off the boat at the docks in East Boston, and seeing a similarly teeming, seething scene, same as back in Liverpool, just muck in the streets and animals everywhere and poverty everywhere, and looking around and saying, this is America. This is what I came here for. And I think that's what greeted Bridget on the other side was, what did I get myself into? This is going to be hard. And it was.
Okay. So in your book, you imply that Bridget had 2 advantages. Well, she had many, but apart from being resourceful, she seemed to speak fluent English. We know a lot of the immigrants who went were Irish speakers. They had no English or little English. And also you imply that she was literate. She was able to read. So that would have given her a great advantage. But like many women, she went that pathway of becoming a Bridget, a maid. So again, do you want to talk about that process and why she would have chosen that pathway?
Yeah, and it's hard to know if she chose that path or if it was chosen for her. As you say, she ended up working as a maid fairly soon after arriving in America. But as I describe in the book, that was almost what was expected of the Irish women who showed up in Boston in particular, but in other cities as well. They didn't have skills that translated easily into jobs that existed in a big city. And in fact, I quote frequently from the Boston Pilot, the Catholic newspaper in Boston at the time, and remarkably still going strong today. The editors of the Boston Pilot would plead with the incoming immigrants, go west. Don't stay in Boston. It's dirty here. It's dangerous. There aren't enough jobs to go around. Get on a train, go west where there are greener pastures, and you can start a farm, you can find land. And I find it incredible that the Irish, and again, many of these first incoming Irish were women, said, no, we're going to stay right here, stay put, figure this out. In the case of the women, the jobs that were available to them were as servants, as domestics, to the point that the name Bridget and maid became interchangeable, right? Boston families would refer to my Bridget or my Biddy being a nickname for Bridget. I mentioned earlier, my grandmother, who was born Bridget Agnes, when she came to America, she changed her name to Della because she didn't want to be known as an Irish Bridget, even though that's the job she took on, just like Bridget Murphy. She worked as a maid. But I think that connotation with, you mentioned Saint Bridget, and I describe her briefly in the book, and how she's the patron saint of those in need. There's a long list of those for whom she is the patron saint, and it's a remarkable list. But she speaks to those who need help because she was a strong figure in Ireland, and I think it's incredible that. I think it was Leisha who mentioned that there's now a more official recognition of St. Bridget's Day as a national holiday. But that connotation that was affiliated with the name Bridget in Ireland, in America, was gone. In America, the affiliation of the name Bridget was a poor Irish servant. But she did that, and she worked hard at it. I had a lot of fun exploring the letters of other Irish maids in America writing back home, and newspaper stories of the day. And what comes through about these women, Bridget Murphy and others, is how resilient and sassy and uncowed and strong-minded that they were. And I think in many cases, they drove their employers crazy. They weren't, the Boston was a very proper and Protestant and puritanical and Brahmin city. And here these Irish maids show up kind of full of themselves, really. They weren't frightened, which I find incredible. They would show up to a job interview and say, okay, I'm interested in this job, but I need Sundays off for mass, and I want Thursday nights off for a dance. And if they didn't get what they wanted, they'd walk out. And so as I learned those stories of other Bridgets, other maids coming to Boston and trying to make their way, I kept Bridget in mind. She didn't leave behind her own letters, so we had to sort of get at her character from other similar, those who experience similar circumstances. But I picture her the same way, not taking any guff from anyone. And I think you see that show up later as she decides, I'm not going to stay as a maid. I'm going to become a hairdresser. I want more. I deserve more. They defended themselves. They defended each other. There was a strong sense of sisterhood and community among the Irish women who came, and among the sort of the sister maids working together and then seeing each other at mass on Sunday and talking about their employers. I think that sense of helping one another and community and support and empathy for one another was fascinating. A remarkable period of time where they're experiencing hardship, but they are going out of their way to help one another and not, step on each other to get to the next level up.
Okay, so at this point, I'm just going to remind people you can ask questions. Please put them in chat. We will get to the questions later. So Neal, you talked about the advice, go west, and the church, the Catholic Church, actually had that advice, especially for young women. They felt that young women in the cities would be corrupted, would be exposed to certain things, including handsome young men. So that brings me to Patrick Kennedy. How did these two meet?
Probably through family. There's some evidence that they may have even been very distantly related back in Ireland. Again, back to my point about Bridget's name being the most common at that time in Ireland. Patrick, also the most common name in Ireland. So there are some challenges to pinpoint certain things in their genealogy and their relationships to one another. But we know that Patrick Kennedy, who also came from a small farm, a little bit bigger than the Murphys, but a farm in County Wexford, worked at a brewery in the town of New Ross, also in County Wexford. And he worked alongside another, I should say Patrick Kennedy was a cooper, a barrel maker, made whiskey and beer barrels, which I think says something about him too. He didn't just want to stay on the farm like his brothers did. He wanted something else, and he got out of the farm and started working in the slightly bigger town of New Ross up the road and developed a skill, barrel making. While he was there at this brewery, he met a fellow Cooper named Patrick Barron, who is related to Bridget, a cousin on her mother's side. We know that the Barrons came to America, to Boston, probably just before or right around the same time as Bridget. So somewhere in there, the Barrons and the Murphys and the Kennedys connect in this new land. Possibly with the help of the Boston Pilot that used to run these ads where people were searching for family friends and relatives. They would post an ad saying, Bridget Murphy seeks Patrick Barron, came to America and such and such. So we don't know exactly how they met. What we do know is by September of 1949, they had fallen in love, to whatever extent that means at that time. We don't know the details, but they married in late September of 1849, excuse me. And they end up settling in East Boston. It's the island across from downtown Boston, and within a couple of years, start a family.
Okay, so I want to go on to the family, but before I do, I just want to ask about the political condition that met them when they arrived in America. You alluded to it, that America has not always been friendly to immigrants, to refugees. So what was the situation that made the 1840s, the 1850s particularly hostile?
Yeah, I was astounded to learn how opposed many in America were at that time to the Irish and to immigrants. I had a general sense of it, but the details that I'll tick some of them off in a second kind of shocked me, or maybe they shouldn't have shocked me given, our history of our ups and downs with our relationship with immigrants. At that time, during the potato famine itself, when word spread across the globe that the Irish were suffering and starving, many Bostonians and others throughout America raised money, sent food and supplies and donations to help the Irish. So there was a brief sense of support and empathy for the Irish. Then they started showing up here in very large numbers, in overwhelming numbers, in the view of Bostonians. I think 1848, Boston saw 25,000 Irish immigrants alone just that year, possibly more, and over time in the millions. So their attitude changed, and I feel like that the fact that they were being inundated by such large numbers, it triggered something that had always been there. It's almost like some recessive thing came back up to the surface, and you saw people lashing out at the Irish into the 1850s in particular. I'll leap ahead and describe the Know Nothing Party. There were political parties that organized around that time and developed a wide following and were very popular, and for a brief period, very powerful. The Native American Party, one of them called themselves, that later became the American Party. There were different versions. There were clubs, there were organizations, there were brotherhoods that all sort of clustered around the same idea of let's keep them out. At times literally using words that we've seen in recent years: build a wall, send them back. We don't want them. They're bringing their crime. They're going to take your jobs. I mean, these were headlines in American newspapers in the 1850s. And from that, you see the rise of what was lumped into the Know Nothing Party. Many members of these different organizations and political parties, it evolved from them. If they were asked what they believe, they would say, I know nothing. So that phrase came to be a catch-all for many of these anti-immigrant, particularly anti-Irish organizations and political organizations and leaders. They rose to power in Massachusetts in 1855. The governor, most of the state legislature, the state senate, local offices in Boston were all held by Know Nothing candidates, because people, I think they freaked out. I think, as I said earlier, it was a very proper and old school and Puritan and Protestant and very English-minded city in Boston. And they didn't know what to make of these Irish. And in particular, they were opposed to their religion. That's what most of these political candidates in the opposition, the political opposition was to the Catholicism. And laws were enacted to attempt to prevent the Irish from holding office, prevent them from voting, prevent them from learning bits of their own history, forcing them to learn sort of Protestant versions of history and English-centric versions of history, keep them out of, keep them from becoming actual citizens. You know, there was one strong effort in Massachusetts to require 21 years of living in the country before you could be considered for citizenship, which didn't pass. But you see these efforts continue from that point forward. It wasn't new and it wasn't gone. I find it remarkable that within a generation, you see the Irish sort of take control of the politics of Boston and start to represent their own kind, which will take us to PJ Kennedy in a minute. But you know, that period had to be terrifying. There were riots, people stomping down the streets of East Boston where Bridget and Patrick lived, and their kids throwing bricks through Irish families' windows, bumping them on the head with bats and bricks and stuff. They weren't wanted, and they knew it.
Yeah, and you talk about convents that were attacked, churches that were set on fire.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was vicious. It was absolutely vicious. And you make the point very well that the Irish escaped one form of oppression to just come into the cauldron of another form of oppression.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think that relates very well. To me, it's interesting. Boston is the center of abolition, but as you say,
Right.
Some abolitionists who were so progressive were also know-nothing, anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, anti-Irish. But the one political party that gave them a home was the Democrat Party, which ironically at that stage was also anti-abolition. So again, maybe when you tell PJ's story, you can speak about that. So this is a good point now to talk about the children, the family, and if you could talk about the mortality of the children, because I think, as I turn the pages, it's, even as a historian, I found it shocking. There was so much death, especially amongst children.
It was shocking to me too, Christine. I mean, I had a sense that life was hard in general terms, but when I realized that, for example, at the time when Bridget was starting her family, the life expectancy of first generation child of an Irish immigrant, the life expectancy was 5 years. And Bridget experienced that herself. She and her husband, Patrick, had 3 daughters and 2 daughters, and then had their first son named John, who lasted 20 months before he died of a condition called cholera infantum, or some summer disease, summer diarrhea. Could have been related to diet or bad milk, or we don't know. But he was one of scores and scores of kids that summer of, I believe it was 1855 when John died, who died of that disease, and then scores who died of other diseases. The death rate among these kids, children of Irish immigrants, was terrifying. I mentioned John. John was the first Kennedy to die on American soil and the first to be buried there. I found it remarkable, back to the opposition to the Irish and the Catholics. Bridget and Patrick couldn't even bury their son John in the city of Boston. There was one Catholic cemetery that was full. None of the other Catholic cemeteries were available to them. They were banned from burying a Catholic child inside the city limits of Boston. So they experienced the tragedy of losing their firstborn son, and they have to travel west to Cambridge, a long and not easy route at that time, to bury their child. And this is the experience of many other Irish immigrants at that time. It was just horrible. Disease in the air, they were just crammed into these apartments, tenement buildings, bad air, bad water. They were just surrounded by filth and disease in the air. And you see that affect that family from that point forward. Later on, as Bridget's own daughters start having their kids, I describe how her daughters. I think it was of 22 eventual grandchildren for Bridget. A dozen survived past age 5. So 10 of the others died very young. It was rough.
Okay. And of course, Patrick.
Yeah. So then Patrick, again, Bridget facing one tragedy after another, one hardship after another. Her husband, Patrick, in 1858, the two of them have a second son, whom they call PJ, Patrick Joseph. He's born in early 1858, but at the time, Patrick was already sick. He was suffering from consumption, which was how tuberculosis was, how it was called at that time. Terrible disease that sometimes took a long time to manifest itself. Some people recovered, but many didn't, especially poor Irish immigrants living in bad conditions and not able to afford a doctor or great food. So PJ Kennedy is 10 months old later in 1858 when Patrick Kennedy, his father, finally dies, leaving Bridget with 3 daughters and a son, all alone, widowed in the slums of East Boston, working as a maid. And as I say in the book, that could have been the end of the Kennedy family right there. And that was for many other families like theirs. And I think it's remarkable that it's almost as if from that point forward, Bridget, I don't want to say bloomed or blossomed. It wasn't that she was waiting for Patrick to die, but something clicked, and she was awakened. And it was soon after that she made this steady progression, step by step, out of the muck into higher wage jobs, and in time to opening her own business, which it was, I find, just extremely remarkable for a woman who was widowed and left with these children to raise on her own, to become a businesswoman and actually a community figure at that time.
Yeah. Again, I found it remarkable. She sort of discovers her agency, I think, after Patrick dies.
Right. Good way to put it. Exactly.
She's determined to survive. And again, maybe just very briefly talk about her role as a hairdresser and as a grocer. I mean, again, things you wouldn't traditionally think of for Irish immigrant women.
Yeah, no, many of them stayed in the job that they seemed destined for, which was to work as a maid. And Bridget, I think it says a lot about her character that she wasn't willing to stay at the bottom. She wanted something more. She had some ambition that drove her to figure out how to take a step up and up. At some point early in the Civil War, or just before the Civil War began, she took on another maid's job, but at a nice hotel in East Boston called Sturtevant House, also known as Maverick House. And I think there she must have made some other connections that led to her next job, which was working as a hairdresser at the Jordan Marsh department store in downtown Boston. Beloved institution eventually, but at the time it was just starting to expand and become departmentalized. It was one of the first that kind of created these different departments: the children's department, toys, shoes, and then the women's department. And in the women's department, Bridget worked as a hairdresser. There are different histories of Jordan Marsh that describe that the rise of that institution and how strong of a leader and employer Eben Jordan, one of the co-founders, was. Who really believed in his employees and helped them in turn sometimes open their own business. So we don't know exactly how long Bridget worked there, but it was clearly long enough to have learned enough about running a business, dealing with customers, understanding commerce, understanding what the people of Boston wanted and they wanted to spend their money on. And at some point, she decided to go out on her own and take a chance and open her own grocery store. The first one was in Maverick Square in East Boston. The shop moved a couple times over the years, but it seems as if sort of late 1870s is when she gets established and finds a home for her grocery store on Border Street in East Boston, and it stays there for the rest of her life. And I find it not just remarkable that a woman at that time, an Irish immigrant widow could do that, because not only was she facing these forces of discrimination, women weren't supposed to be running businesses at that time in Boston, just like they weren't supposed to be running for office because they couldn't vote. There were many things that they were prevented from doing. And in fact, if she had still been married, she would have been required to get a married woman doing business license from the city and permission from her husband to open that grocery store. Because she was a widow and didn't have a husband, she was able to open it on her own without someone's permission. And I think all of these little tidbits say a lot about her not caring what anybody thought, doing her own thing, deciding this is what I need to do for myself and my family, and I'm going to do it.
So that brings us nicely to PJ, who is her son, who never meets his father, and who, as you say, has his mother's spirit of entrepreneurship. From what you say, he seems to have been very charming. He didn't start off too well, but he really, chose the right path. Would you like to talk about PJ?
Yeah, and that's a good sort of introduction to how the book is structured. It is kind of two halves. The first half of the book is Bridget and her story coming from Ireland to America and getting settled and facing all these hardships and finally making her way to a place of agency and control over her own destiny as a independent business owner and an entrepreneur. Just a remarkable trajectory. And then the second half of the book picks up with her son PJ and largely shows how through Bridget's influence on his life, he also made something of a similar trajectory. As you said, he had a rough childhood, fatherless kid, roaming the streets of East Boston, getting in trouble. The schools weren't well set up to teach Irish kids at that time. There weren't parochial schools yet. They were just getting started in different cities, and it was just too early for PJ to benefit from that. So he didn't go to school for very long. He ended up briefly at a house of detention on Deer Island here in Boston, probably for truancy, although the records don't show exactly what he was charged with, nor how long he spent there. But clearly he had a difficult childhood. And then once he gets to his late teens, he's working on the docks of East Boston, where his father used to work, as a longshoreman, just hauling cargo on and off ships, like many Irish men did at that time, either immigrants or first generation. That was the kind of work they did, manual labor, digging ditches, building the railroads, or hauling cargo on and off ships. PJ, though, similarly had some sense of aspiration and ambition and decided to get into business for himself. Opened his own saloon in South Boston and probably borrowed money from his mother, it seems, and probably one of his sisters who was working at the grocery shop with Bridget. I think they helped get him started in the saloon business. And then it's almost like a switch was flipped. He discovers something new in himself, his own capabilities and what his interests are. He opens another saloon and another one after that, and a retail liquor business. And at the same time that his business is growing and his business sensibilities are sort of evolving, he's getting involved in local ward politics for the Democratic Party, which is where sort of the next phase of his career takes him. But interestingly, it's very tightly entwined with his career as a saloon keeper and a liquor man. And I love too, Christine, the sort of the sense that his father was a barrel maker, made whiskey barrels and beer barrels. His mother was a grocer who almost certainly sold whiskey on the side, because many of the Irish groceries made more money that way, and that's what the customers wanted. So whiskey in his parents' side, and then you see PJ getting involved in the whiskey business, and then that later transfers into some of his son's business enterprises down the line. But PJ's a remarkable character, and I'll pause there.
Very likable, I have to say. I liked him a lot. The spirit business in Ireland, they have what they used to call spirit groceries. So again, the grocers had the spirits. And I think just when I think about Bridget as the hairdresser and PJ as the barman, they are two professions where people confide in you. so they must have heard lots of secrets and got lots of information through those. I think it tells you something about their personalities, that they worked in those trades, professions. But you talk about the spirits, the whiskey, and we know that Boston also was the center of temperance. There were many attempts, which I hadn't realized, to introduce prohibition on a small scale, on a large scale in America before prohibition. And even though you say PJ was probably moderate, as was Bridget, in their drinking habits, it was something, for obvious reasons, they resisted. Could you just maybe talk a bit about prohibition, its history in America?
Yeah, I mean, again, it was this interesting bit of tension in PJ's growing career to learn that there were these forces aligned against him, just like there were forces aligned against his mother. The Prohibition Party, there was a political party again, was very strong in Massachusetts and did their best to prevent businessmen like PJ from thriving. I mean, what they really wanted was just to ban all liquor sales, period. And, in time that succeeded. But there were ups and downs. And I didn't know this either, Christine, that in the state of Massachusetts, because that's where my story takes place, the political party had its ups and downs. And so one year they would ban liquor sales and parts of Boston or all of Boston would go dry or only allow beer sales. And then a couple of years later, the political leadership would shift a little bit and suddenly liquor sales are allowed again. There was a period where they required that meals are served and you had to be seated in a bar like PJ's. There was no vertical drinking in Boston. And what they wanted to prevent was saloons and bars where, in their view, the Irish were hanging out, getting too drunk, which sure, that was probably the case in a lot of places, but it was a communal space. It was, for the Irish, a place, again, they clustered's not the right word, but they ended up living in urban environments and they wanted to be near each other. And so the places where they could be together were the grocery store, the saloon, and church. And I think it's remarkable that both PJ and Bridget sort of provided that service, that space where their people could get together, talk about issues, just have fun, be with one another. And I think in PJ's case, that's where he developed his political skills, because he would hear directly from his constituents, from other Irish people, from neighbors, what was going on and what they needed. And in turn, he applied that to how he could help once he got into elected office and then these increasing positions of power as a political leader in Boston.
And again, you talk about the success of the Irish immigrants in politics. And I sometimes think it's because even before they arrived in America, Irish people were in fact highly politicized, largely because of Daniel O'Connell, the mass meetings, the use of propaganda, of media, etc. So I think they were already very sophisticated in terms of being political activists. So to me, it's interesting. But can you tell us more about PJ, his character, and maybe his relation with Honey Fitz?
Yeah. I love that relationship. So I think as a character behind the bar, there's one scene in the book where I describe him serving drinks. He was a quiet man. He was pretty reserved and thoughtful. He wasn't boisterous or blustering. He liked to listen more than he did to speak. If it was quiet at the bar, he'd bury his head in a book or a newspaper. So I think he was pretty reserved and thoughtful. But more than anything, I think he liked to hear what people were thinking and what they needed, and then figure out a way to help. I'd say this is probably a good point to call out one of the resources that helped me enormously in bringing PJ to life. And these are the PJ Kennedy papers that are at the John F. Kennedy Library archives. They were just opened, I think it was 2021. I'm forgetting. These were papers that I was aware of for years and had many conversations with the archive staff at the library saying, are they ready yet? Are they ready yet? Are they ready yet? And then finally they were processed. It was a long time coming for them to process these old crumbly letters of PJ's. But I wanted to make that call out because the library was incredibly patient and generous with me in helping me access those, and they helped bring PJ to life. Those letters said a lot about PJ, both behind the bar and as a politician, because all he wanted to do was help. A sampling of those letters just says volumes about who PJ was, because he would write a letter to a politician or an employer or a priest and say, hey, this poor kid so-and-so needs a job, can we help him out? Or I'm just become aware of this political candidate. They've been so helpful in our community and I really think they deserve our support. Can we help them out? He was always trying to help. Later, Joe Kennedy, his son, would say he went too far. He gave away too much of his money helping other people, loaning money to incoming Irish or business owners who needed a leg up. I think he was just generous to a fault. And I love that about him. I think he was just a good guy, a good man. But to your question, I find it fascinating that alongside that character is Honey Fitz, remarkable guy, just like lively, loved to dance his jigs and sing Sweet Adeline at political rallies. And when he was campaigning, they both were American-born sons of Irish immigrant grocers. They had very similar upbringings and lives as boys. And I describe in the book how they should have been friends. They could have been soulmates. And instead, when they both got involved in politics, they became rivals and stayed that way for much of their careers. There were times where they worked together and they worked with each other because they were part of this small, outmanned Irish Democratic Party trying to rise to power in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. But they didn't like each other. They tried to keep their sons and daughters apart. Joe Kennedy ends up marrying Rose Fitzgerald, despite the best efforts of their parents. But there's one scene in the book that I describe where Honey Fitz, as he was known, is elected to Congress. Part of this rise of Irish Democratic political leaders in Boston and eventually nationally. Honey Fitz is always charging, always working, always giving speeches and always moving. He's a fascinating character, but he gets sick with consumption, the same disease that killed PJ's father. And his doctors tell him, you have to take a break. You have to go somewhere and relax and rest. So they send him south. He chooses Asheville, North Carolina as his place to rest at a spa. And he invites PJ to come with him and help him recoup and get back in shape and then come back to Washington and pick up where he left off. So the relationship between the two is strange and tense and kind of weirdly beautiful in a way, I think.
Yeah, there's a beautiful image of them on horses.
Yeah, from the Kennedy Library, they have this beautiful photo of them. Yeah, they have that.
It's lovely. Okay, so we're coming up to question time, and there's a lot of questions. Please send more in. But let's skip over Joe. But let's talk about PJ as a grandfather, and obviously grandfather to somebody famous.
Say that one more time.
PJ as a grandfather and the relationship between PJ and his grandchildren.
Yeah. Again, back to the Kennedy Library, they have some wonderful images. I think many of them available digitally online that people can see of PJ. As he gets older, he loved being a grandfather, and he loved all of his kids. Joe and Jack firstborn, and then Rosemary, I think, came next. I might have it out of order, but as he started winding down his political career, PJ, and his businesses, and in particular when Prohibition finally went into effect and he had to sell his saloons, he was in the liquor business with his wife Mary right to the very end. I found a liquor license application in 1919, so they were hopeful right to the very end. But finally, that Prohibition goes into effect, and he starts to scale back his work and semi-retire. And from that point forward, like through the 1920s, he loved spending time with his grandkids. There are just some wonderful photos of him with the grandkids at the beach. They weren't at Hyannis at that point. I can't remember the name of the beaches that they would visit, but he was a devoted grandfather. He would show up with bags of toys. He would but it's interesting that he also was, John Kennedy, JFK, later described him as kind of serious and kind of reserved. He wasn't playful necessarily. JFK makes a comment about you couldn't even wink in front of Papa. He thought that was too playful. So there was a love for these kids, but also some sense of teaching them to take life seriously and not goof around too much. And there's this message that he also conveyed to his son Joe about, like, do the right thing, don't get in trouble, do right by your people. I think he had integrity, and he tried to pass that on to his son. I'm not sure. We can talk about that some other time. But there are other things that he transferred onto other members of that family that they did latch onto, and you see it in their own lives in terms of how they represented others and how they embraced the empathy for those who in need and those who were discriminated against, knowing what it was like for PJ and Bridget before.
Maybe, and then we'll move on to listeners' questions. Just the reconnection with Ireland. How did that come about?
PJ's reconnection?
Yeah.
Late in life, his first trip was, I think, early 1900s. His wife, Mary, always thought he was working too hard and always would tell him, you're going on a trip. I'm not telling you where. I'm going to pack your bags. And he would find out sort of the day before where she was sending him. And that seems to have been the case when she finally said, you're going to Ireland. So he goes on this European tour. He visits on the back end Ireland and meets with his ancestors. And spends time there riding around on a buggy towed behind a horse. He meets extended family members. He comes home with a notebook that was his father's from when his brief time in school. And he just loved it and admired all these people. But it triggered, he looked back on his political career, and he commented a number of times about how influential the plight of the Irish was on his own political career. And when he first got started in politics, he was deeply involved in land league organizations, groups that were trying to raise money to send back to Ireland to help tenant farmers, pay for back rent, including his own family, his father's family. So I think he knew that he owed something to his homeland because they inspired him to protect his people here in America while he was also trying to help folks back in Ireland. So I think it was a wonderful trip for him, and it connected him to his mother, who had been dead at that point for, I think, 30 years. She died in 1888. Later, when his wife Mary dies, he goes back to Ireland for a second time. So he had a deep connection, and I think that connection was picked up by some of his grandchildren too. And I write at the tail end of the book how John Kennedy in particular really embraced his Irishness, went back to that country many times, famously just months before he died, went back to New Ross and met with his family and talked about his grandfather, the barrel maker, who, came from these shores and came to America. So that trajectory, I think, is just wonderful, of Bridget and PJ, and then he goes back to Ireland, and then JFK goes back to Ireland, and it just ties into this epic and tragic saga of this family coming from a crumbling place and coming to a land that didn't want them, but making it their own and having such an incredible impact on our politics and our culture and who we are. It's remarkable.
Okay, thank you. That's a great point now to go to questions. And I know we have people who've joined us from all over the world, particularly America, Canada, Ireland. So we want to say you're all very welcome. So there's quite a few questions. And one of them is, were any of the children, grandchildren, descendants named Bridges, or was that name too associated with being a servant and therefore derogatory?
There were none that I found. The family, as we know, was very large. With 9 kids by Joe and Rose, and I forget if it was 11 or 12 by Bobby and Eunice, and so there might be extended family members named Bridget, but none in the sort of core family descended from Joe and Rose and John and Bobby and their siblings. And I think some of that comes from Joe Kennedy, who, unlike PJ, didn't embrace his Irishness, and it makes sense, right? So PJ needed to be an Irish-minded person because he was still in the muck with his fellow Irish, trying to become politically active and influential. By the time Joe is raising his family and getting into business and trying to make money, he wanted to become American. He no longer wanted to have any sort of affiliation with the old sod and where he came from. I can't say he rejected it entirely, but he didn't embrace his Irishness or his roots in the same way that others throughout that family did. And so, you see the names in that family: John, Robert, Theodore, Eunice. There is a Patricia, which is my mother's name, Kathleen. So, no Bridgets, little more Americanized than Irish. I think some of that goes a little bit back further to PJ's wife, Mary Augusta Hickey, who we haven't talked enough about, who, when Joe was born, decided he's not going to be a Patrick or a PJ. No more Patricks in this house. He's going to be Joseph. So I think she influenced that sense that we're American now. We're going to become, an American family. So no more Bridgets from that point forward, as far as we know.
Okay, no more Bridgets or Patricks for now.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. How did you find out about PJ's papers, and what was the most interesting aspect of them?
I think I first became aware of the PJ papers at the Kennedy Library around 2016, 2017. And I not too long ago was looking at my emails, and there are many, many of them to the archive staff saying, "Me again, are they ready? What's going on? Can I come look at them?" And I learned over time that the process is not that easy. These were old onion skin papers, very delicate, fragile, needed a certain type of processing to digitize them. They also needed to be digitized fully and then presented, because it's a federal institution, presented at one time to everyone. They couldn't just give me a side door access to them, despite my best efforts. But 2017 is when I learned more about them and a little bit what was in them. And it took years of being patient and staying in touch with the archive staff. And in late 2019, the process had begun in full. There was funding for this, and they were starting the process. And then into 2020, we know what happened. Everything shut down. So I was terrified that what I hoped was a potential gold mine for a researcher was maybe not going to be available to me for this book. To their great credit, the staff stayed with it. They ended up working at offsite and managed to process, I think it was the first 2/3 of the papers. They're not fully processed yet, but I got this wonderful, wonderful email one morning. "Hey, Neal, good news. We did this percentage of the papers, and here they are." And in one lump, I had access to hundreds of pages of PJ's business documents and personal letters. And it was Christmas for a researcher. You know what that feeling is like, Christine, to find this trove of just like primary source, original words written in pen and ink by PJ in his own hand. It was just fascinating and thrilling. And it helped me bring him to life a little bit more so than I would have, because you heard him thinking out loud. You heard him doing the business of trying to help other people in his community. I can't think of one letter in particular that was, more moving than any other, but there was a theme throughout every page of this collection. And the theme was, "I'm PJ, I'm in a position to help, and I want to help. How can we help this other person?" It's remarkable.
Fantastic. Yeah, it is fantastic. So one question asks, did the early Kennedys have any other European connections?
European connections. The early Kennedys, as in Bridget and Patrick, do you think that's what they mean?
Mm-hmm.
None that I know of. Bridget never went back to Ireland. Patrick died at 35-ish in East Boston. I know they stayed in touch with their relatives in Ireland because Bridget's sisters start to come to America in the 1870s and on forward, her sisters and nieces, mostly women, again, coming first. And they live with her or end up living near her. They helped out at the grocery shop. So she stayed in very close contact with her family in Ireland and with her then dead husband's family in Ireland as well. But I'm not aware of any other connections elsewhere.
Yeah. And just the early generation, they seem to have intermarriage with other Irish people. Again,
right.
Be very typical.
Right. Good point. Yeah. They did. They married their own kind,
Even Wexford, even that level of the same county.
Right.
One question asks, did any of the current Kennedy family assist you with your research?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because I did reach out to as many current family members as I could and tried to make them aware of this project and let them know I would love to get their thoughts on it. And a few of them responded, and the theme, interestingly, was, we love that you're doing this, and we don't know. We just don't know enough to offer any help here. I got one nice note from Maria Shriver saying, "I wish I could help. I look forward to your book so I can learn more about my family." And I think that was the case. And it sort of goes back a little bit to that other question about sort of the Americanization and the lack of Bridgets in that family line. They became very American and moved on from the experiences of Bridget and Patrick. And I think, not that anyone's to blame for this, I don't know my own history going back that far, but I think that's why Bridget's story got lost a little bit. The story of the Kennedys in the 20th century is a big story. We're still fascinated by that piece of the legacy and the mythology of Camelot and all of that. Interest in going back and finding the details of what was actually happening before that and what was happening with Bridget. So the family is helpful and cooperative to the extent that they could be, and gracious, but just didn't know much.
Okay, well, they will now as a result of your research, which is great. One question asks, were Bridget and Patrick documented or undocumented? But we know there were no such things as being documented.
No such things.
Would you like to talk about it a bit more, or just?
Yeah, and I'll preface it by saying I don't know. I'm not as well versed in the laws of the land as it relates to immigrants at different periods of time. But I will say, when Bridget and Patrick came, there were no laws that prevented them from coming. And that's what triggered much of the animosity and antipathy toward immigrants, was that there was nothing to stop them from coming in. There was a Immigration Act of 1798, maybe, but again, I don't want to bungle this, but really, if you showed up and you were able to find a job and live here, nobody could stop you. Later, I think, inspired by the reaction to the waves of Irish who came, because that was really the first big wave of immigrants from any other country. They've been trickling in from around the world for since the very beginning of the American experiment. But the waves of Irish immigrant put that experiment to the test for some people. And that's when you started to see new laws being proposed to restrict immigration against certain areas and certain populations. You see the Chinese Exclusion Act, 1882, I believe, that specifically said, whoa, we need to slow down the flow of immigration from China. The Geary Act a decade later, which emphasized that. 1917, I think, was the Immigration Act of 1917 that started to pull together some of the nativist ideas around, let's slow this down. Let's create a literacy test for people coming into the country. They have to, be able to write or speak the Constitution or something like that. So you didn't see any real laws to require documentation or no documentation for a long time. That evolved over time, but it was, I think, initially triggered by the first waves of Irish.
Okay, so Neal, you can't see yourself. Maybe you can't, maybe you can, but you're surrounded by a beautiful golden glow. And one of the questions is, where are you?
I'm actually glad someone asked that, because just a few hours ago, I was in my hotel room here in Boston, where I'm here talking at different locations about the new book, and the Wi-Fi went down. And in a panic, I called friends here at the Massachusetts Historical Society. That's where I am. In downtown Boston. I was here a couple of nights ago to give a talk, and I asked them, can I please come there and do my talk with the JFK Library at your facility? And they quickly and graciously set me up in this room. It's the library. I think it's the Douthat Library. And so these are old books behind me, and I'm so grateful to them for allowing me to come take up some space. And that's them right there.
Okay, thank you. Interesting question about religion. What did the Irish do to hold on to their faith? And if you could then relate it back to the Kennedys, please.
Yeah, that's a good one, because we haven't talked about it yet. And faith was such an important factor for the Irish, even though it was the thing that caused them to face down the discrimination that they faced. Church was vital to them. I describe in the book the Kennedys, the places where they lived and worked, all sort of circulated around their parish and their church. St. Nicholas Church was the small church where they first began worshiping in East Boston. And then that was later expanded into a cathedral. And so the priests in their life were incredibly influential and important. I found a remarkable collection of research about the history of the Archdiocese of Boston. It's a huge, I think, 3-volume history of that, and it introduced me to some of the priests and archbishops who were involved deeply in the Kennedys' lives. We know that they were churchgoers. We know that they had all their children baptized at the local church in East Boston, and so I think faith was vital to them. I think you could argue that that's probably what helped get Bridget through some of the more tragic and challenging periods of her life. And then PJ and his wife were extremely devout. In fact, when they, toward the end of their life, PJ's wife, Mary, died in 1926. She had a small altar in their house where she would kneel and pray, and they were very close with their priests as well. So yeah, I think faith and the Catholic Church meant a lot to the early Kennedys.
Yeah, and just as you said, bar rooms gave a sense of community. So did church going. I think community, absolutely. Identity, security. So I think it was very important, especially for the early immigrants. So one question sort of follows on from that. You talk about East Boston. When did the Irish migrate to South Boston?
They started there too. When they came to Ireland, they ended up in different pockets. I've been talking a lot about East Boston because that's where the Kennedys ended up. But a lot of immigrants settled in South Boston, in the North End, which is where the Fitzgerald family ended up. The West End, which was actually a pretty strong African-American community for many years, but then the Irish kept moving their way in, as they did in other parts of Boston, and sort of pushing people out of their own community. So the Irish took over many corners of Boston. And I find it interesting that over time you see South End and other communities remaining strongly Irish. East Boston changed over time from Irish to Italian. And I was walking through there just last year, one last time before the book came out, and found it remarkable that it's still an immigrant community. Brazilian, Central American, South American. You see these little grocery shops, bodegas, and Latin markets on the street corners. The same way, many decades earlier, you saw the Irish grocery shops on the corners. So that community remains sort of a starter community for new immigrants in America. And you see their starter businesses, hopeful, aspiring businesses, just like PJ's Saloon and Bridget's grocery store.
Okay. So we have a question from somebody who's doing their family history, and they say, do you have any best kept secrets? Are there any sources you would advise people that they should use when they're doing research?
I'm assuming that means their own family research. And one of the things I ran up against with this book, like many authors and researchers, like we all did, was COVID. And I was pretty far along in the research and writing when COVID hit, but there were many little gaps I needed to fill in the story, and relied on the internet, and was pretty shocked to learn how much I had access to at my fingertips through a number of different sources. And in the back of the book, I cite them all. So if anyone's curious, you could just go through the end notes. I think I have like 40 pages of end notes where a lot of these sources are listed, but a couple of them include ancestry.com. The Church of Latter-day Saints has digitized literally billions of pages of records. Ship manifest records and birth records and court records, you name it. And so through Ancestry.com, I was able to really get a glimpse into the genealogy of the extended Kennedy family, where they started in Ireland and where they ended up in the US. Another one was newspapers.com. Incredible. I mean, you pay for these, most of them. There are others, familysearch.org and myheritage.com. Again, you'll find them in the book. Some are free, some are paid, but newspapers.com was probably my favorite. I'm a ex-newspaper reporter. So it was a thrill. Instead of having to go to a library, and I loved going to libraries and archives and digging through files and folders and working with the staff and getting their input on my research, going through microfilm, even though it's probably why I need glasses now. But the newspapers.com experience, because I was forced to adapt to that, was remarkable. I could go to the 1880s and just flip through the daily newspaper, the Boston Globe, page after page after page, and get a sense of what was happening around Bridget and PJ and their families at that time. So that was remarkable and just fun. And also an interesting way to sort of research your own family and your own past.
Yeah, I think newspapers are a great underlooked resource. You never know what you'll find, and it becomes addictive because it's so easy to do the search, and suddenly that takes you into a different direction you hadn't thought about. And then you see an advert for a circus, and you get like John Lennon, "What's this circus?" being for the benefit of Mr. Kite. It just takes you all over the place. So yeah, that's I get it very much. How wonderful newspapers
Many rabbit
are.
holes, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are nearing the end of this wonderful talk. So we've covered a lot of ground, we've covered a lot of geography, but is there anything you think we haven't talked about that you would like to bring to our attention in regard to the early Kennedys?
I don't think so. I'll take just a pause to thank you, Christine, for your great questions and for being so thoughtful and generous with your time. It's a thrill because you've written a lot about some of this era that I cover, and I remember being nervous in the early stages, thinking this has been done by other academics like yourself, and I've always tried to find my way into a narrow space that maybe hadn't been explored as much as others before me had explored it. And I guess in summary, that's what I hope comes out of this, is a sense that we think we know the Kennedy family, but but this little piece of their past hasn't been fully explored, and that there are some important characters in the history of that family that deserve more, not just attention, but credit than they have previously received. And in my view, that's Bridget and her son PJ. You know, there are many others, obviously, but I chose to focus in on those two for this my version of the Kennedy story. And I think it's remarkable. And I'd also add, I guess, my hope has been that in telling their story and the story of the early Kennedys and the story of Irish immigration in the 1800s, ideally it tells us more about who we are as a country, who we were then, who we are now. The similarities between the two are kind of remarkable. And I think we can learn a lot from some of the low points of the 1800s in terms of how we treated immigrants and how we think of immigrants today. You know, if you think about it, the Bridget Kennedy, the matriarch of the Kennedy family, as I call her, that woman could be working as a maid in East Boston now. And so this sense of the strength of our acceptance of the immigrant experience here in America, it's vital. It is who we are. You know, the term "a nation of immigrants" is I think tricky because we aspire to that, but we don't always live up to that ideal, being a true nation of immigrants. It's my hope that this book reminds us of the power of that aspiration.
That's very powerful. Thank you. My great friend, Dr. Jared Moran, always says, we have 8 million immigrants from the famine onwards to America, and we have 8 million different stories. And I think what you've done is tell us very eloquently, very poignantly, one of those really important stories. So it's not just about the Kennedys, it's about Irish immigration to America, it's about women's resilience, it's about what it means to be a refugee. So it's much bigger than the Kennedy story. So for that, I thank you. I thank our hosts at the library, I thank the Consul General of Boston, and I thank everybody who has joined us tonight. Happy St. Patrick's Month. Thank you.
Happy St. Patty's Month. Thank you, Christine. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.